video at some point about the Titanic, but I couldn't figure out exactly what I wanted to do with it. And so when I found these really old newspapers, I realized that I could look up some of the newspaper articles from when the Titanic sunk, which was in the year 1912, and I believe it was April 14th, I think. I don't know if it was April 14th or 15th now, but so I went ahead and I found a lot of different newspaper articles about the Titanic, so I printed out just a couple of different things and pictures. So I will just quickly go through a couple of the things that I printed out. So these are from different newspapers. I just sort of printed a page here, a page there, and they're from different dates. And I have my magnifying glass in case it's hard to see. So I'll let's see. Just shine the light for a moment. You can see there's a picture there. And I wrote down here because the title of the newspaper didn't print out. But this is from April 16th, 1912. And this is from a newspaper or some sort of publication called The Day Book, and it's from Chicago, Illinois. So let's see here. It says, Titanic, 45,000 ton monster ready for service. So let's see. I don't need the magnifying glass for this. It says, only the other day the Lusitania and the Mauretania were the world wonder sisters of the briny. Now they must yield the palm to a new pair of marine twins, the Olympic and the Titanic. This pair has just been filled out by the completion of the Titanic and the Olympic being already in commission. The Titanic, which is shown here lying at the dock at Belfast, preparatory to her trials, is 882 feet long and of 92 feet beam. She is nearly 100 feet longer than any other ship in the world, except her sister, and her tonnage, 45,000, is 13,000 in excess of that of the biggest of rival liners. Her engines, 50,000 horsepower, are both turbine and reciprocating, are expected practically to eliminate vibration. She has accommodations for 5,000 passengers. She cost $7,500,000. The Titanic is not a speed marvel. She makes but 21 knots as against the Mauretania's 25, but she is the last word in the way of comfort and luxury in transatlantic travel. And so I am not sure yet if they were aware yet that the ship had sunk, or if this was sort of just a look back after they had heard the news, but it wasn't very long after, and I'm not sure. I would think they would have known, but Maybe they were just showing some information about the Titanic. So, let's see. And that's all I printed of that little article there. I just thought it was interesting that they were just sort of boasting about what a great ship it was. And so this here, this one I forgot to write the date on, but this was after they had already known about the sinking of the ship. Must have been some time after they already knew what happened. Not sure if this light helps or makes it worse. But you can see here, they have these women here. And it says, "Death in husband's arms, better than life alone for these heroines of the Titanic." It says, "The Titanic heroines, Mrs. H.J. Allison above, and Mrs. Isidore Strauss. The quiet, smiling heroism of two women stand preeminent among the thrilling stories told by Titanic survivors. The love that was greater than death, as displayed by Mrs. H.G. Allison of Milwaukee and Mrs. Isidore Strauss of New York, both went down with their husbands on the Titanic, refusing rescue at the cost of separation and afterlife of loneliness." So, I'm not sure that's really fair to say that that's why they did what they did, but maybe it is. I don't know. I feel like I wouldn't have left my husband either, but for different reasons. But it was a different time, so I just thought that one was interesting. I know the Titanic is something that a lot of people are very interested in. And there's a lot of different movies and books about it. I remember my mother had a really big sort of picture book, different information about it. I used to look at it all the time. And of course all of the movies. So I thought it was cool to see. When I was reading a lot of these different articles, you could sort of see where they most likely got a lot of the information for a lot of the movies and all that. So this is from another publication from Chicago, and this is dated Monday, April 15th, 1912. This is called The Day Book from Chicago, and it's a longer article, so I will read this. So here it says, "Biggest steamer ever afloat, crumpled up like toy in nighttime. Wireless saves 2,000 passengers and crew. Halifax, what is NS? Nova Scotia, is that what NS is? April 15th. Kept afloat only by her watertight compartments, the great white starliner Titanic slowly is crawling toward this harbor. Her 1,470 passengers were taken off and put aboard other steamers in mid-ocean. They may thank a calm sea and the wireless that they are alive today. The disaster to the Titanic is unequaled in the history of navigation. The largest, most luxurious, and best appointed vessel that ever floated, she seemed proof against disaster. Hardly another ship afloat could have withstood the terrific shock when the Titanic, driving through the night at more than half speed ahead, crashed bow on into a great submerged iceberg. Just how the accident happened, whether there was a panic among the passengers, is not yet known here. Only the wireless appeals for help came from the stricken ship. Captain E. S. Smith, Admiral of the White Star fleet of liners, and in command of the Titanic, realized acutely the danger to his passengers. We're up here now. The first message was received at the Cape Race wireless station at 10:25 p.m. last night. It was demand for immediate help. From Cape Race, the news was spread far and wide by wireless and by telegraph. Vessel was reached and given the position of the Titanic and urged to make all speed to her aid. The Allen liner Virginian was the first. She turned her prow toward the wounded giant of the seas and set out under forced draught. Then the Carpathia of the, I don't know if that's Cunard or Cunard line, and the Baltic, sister ship of the wrecked vessel, and the Allen liner Parisian were reached, and all proceeded toward the Titanic. Then came a time of cruel waiting. From the moment the first message reached Cape Race Station until 12:27 a.m., there came flash after flash from the Titanic, and each message was the same. Hurry, hurry. We are sinking and the passengers may be lost. Nothing could be done from the shore. The Titanic lay 450 miles south of Cape Race and 1,150 miles due east of New York. The ship was going 22 knots when she struck. The stern rose in the air. People ran, shrieking from below. Women and children were rushed to the lifeboats. Sailors tore the women from the husbands to whom they were clinging and flung them into the boats. The boats were lowered as quickly as possible. I have heard several men had to be shot down. I do not know if this be true. I was too far aft to tell. I'm sorry, this is a new story. This is a story from C.H. Stengel of Newark, New Jersey. This is his account, I think. He was on the ship. And the title here says, Mrs. Isidore Strauss refused to leave her husband. They went down together. Okay, let me continue here. Hundreds upon hundreds of men jumped into the sea when they saw there was no chance of getting on the boats. I do not know how they died. I was lucky. I caught a lifeboat by the gunwale the first time I rose, and I was dragged aboard. There were not enough sailors in the boats to row them. The women were forced to pull oars. Some of the women shrieked the names of their husbands as they rowed. John J. Astor kissed his wife goodbye, drew himself to attention, and stood waiting for the end. Bruce Ismay jumped into a lifeboat. He was the first in it. He sat there waiting for the women and children to get in. I never shall forget Isidor Straus and his wife. They were Darby and Joan in life. So also were they in death. Mrs. Strauss came on deck with her husband. A sailor yelled to her to get into a boat. She put her arms about her white-haired husband and shook her head. Two sailors caught hold of her and tried to drag her from her husband. She would not let go of him. The sailors had to give it up. As our boat drew away, we could see them standing there together, Strauss with his arms about his wife, bending over her, so they died. This is a new story here. And down here is an account of, correct report of the number lost and saved. And it's broken down by what class they were on the ship. Lost. From first class, 120. From second class, 195 people. From third class, 550 people. And officers and crew, 730 people. Total victims, 1,595. So I'm not sure if this number changed or not. The only hope for her passengers seemed to be from vessels in her immediate vicinity. At 12:27 a.m., a message was relayed to the shore. All women and children among passengers have been put in lifeboats, which are being held ready for lowering at moment's notice. 3 times the message was repeated, and then the wireless fell silent, and every attempt made by the stations on shore to get into communication with the sinking liner failed. Then the communication with the Virginian ceased, and those on shore could only wait helplessly. It is known now that the reason the wireless failed was the atmospheric condition in the ice field in which the Titanic was lying helpless. But at the time it was feared that the great liner and her passengers and crew had sunk to the bottom of the sea. At 8:30 this morning, a brief wireless saying that the Titanic was still afloat and proceeding under her own steam was picked up. The White Star office in New York issued an official statement that it would be impossible for the Titanic to sink, no matter how badly she might have been injured. Shortly after 9 o'clock, a message was received that the Carpathia, the Parisian, and the Virginian were standing by the stricken ship, and that the Baltic was coming up fast. Shortly afterwards came another message saying that the transfer of the passengers had been begun. The first boat loads were rowing to the Carpathia, or Carpathia. The lifeboats of the Titanic represent the last word in safety. They are wide and non-sinkable. Each can hold 50 passengers. Only 35 were taken at a time today, however. The work of transferring passengers at sea always is full of danger. It was less so today than usual. The wind had died down to nothing at all. The sea was comparatively quiet. Many of the passengers carried their most valuable belongings with them. There was no attempt to move hand baggage. Nearly all the first-class passengers of the great liner were financiers or society leaders. A conservative estimate of the value of jewelry and bonds carried among them is $5 million. There was a great deal of conflict between the wireless messages received this afternoon. One dispatch to Montreal declared the Titanic had sunk. The conflict of messages was due to interference with messages and because all wireless messages had to be relayed. Just what is to be done with the passengers transferred from the Titanic has not been decided. They may be transferred at sea again and put aboard the Baltic and brought to New York. They may stay on the steamers they now are on, and these ships may simply be ordered to Halifax. And then it goes on, but I didn't print the entire article, I'm sorry. So I also printed some pictures. Not sure if you can see. Let's see. It was a little hard to get it very clear. It says first photographs of scenes connected with the Titanic disaster. And this is from the San Francisco Call, Wednesday, April 24th, 1912. And it says authentic pictures of survivors and their arrival in New York City on the rescue ship Carpathia. Let's see. Not sure you can see that picture there, but the caption below, let's see, it says survivors on the deck of the Carpathia just before they reached New York. This photograph was taken by Miss Bernice Palmer, who, with other women passengers on the Carpathia, supplied those who were rescued with wraps and shawls. And this picture down here. Let's see, this one says, arrival of the Carpathia with the survivors of the Titanic as the ship appeared off Fire Island on its way to the Cunard dock in New York. And then down here, if you can see that, it says first photograph of the Titanic's lifeboats on the side of the Carpathia as the ship came alongside the Cunard Line Pier in New York. And then down here you can see all the crowds of people. And it says this is the crowd that assembled off the Cunard Line Pier on the on the arrival in New York of the Carpathia with the survivors of the Titanic. And then back up here, And this one says, Another group on board the Carpathia takes on the second day of the rescue ship's journey from the scene of the disaster to New York City. And here you can see all the people on the ship. So this one says, this picture shows the survivors of the Titanic on the Carpathia waiting for a pilot to board the vessel. And this one here is hard to see anything. Looks like another picture of the lifeboats. See, it says this photograph shows the Titanic's lifeboats in the water alongside the Carpathia as the vessel was entering its dock in New York. You can see some people on there. And this last picture down here, you can see all of the men there. Senate committee investigating the Titanic disaster at the Waldorf Astoria. J. Bruce Ismay sits at the end of the table with his hand in his face. A lot of interesting things to print out, but there was a little bit too much. So now this is the San Francisco Call again, and this is April 24th, 1912. And you can see the news is starting to change a little bit here. So Mrs. Astor, you'll see, and Mrs. Ismay. I think these were some of the prominent people. They, I don't know if their husbands were, had something to do with the ship or the White Star Line company, maybe. I think we'll read about it. So this talks about Mrs. Ismay is a nervous wreck. American wife of head of White Star Line asks for suspension of judgment. I guess they were, I'm not sure if he was charged with something or not. It says London, April 23rd. An American woman in London, the wife of one of the men, he was saved. One of the men saved from the roll of the Titanic's dead is bowed down with weight of woe, which is attracting the heartfelt sympathy of all England. This woman, a nervous wreck from bitter anguish and indignation, is the wife of J. Bruce Ismay, the head of the White Star Line, now the center spot of criticism throughout the United States. Mrs. Ismay is one, at least, who repudiates the charges against her husband, and she is an American who loves her country and venerates its code of chivalry. Here is a pathetic figure as she passes from periods of utter collapse to hysterical efforts to call her husband to her side. she has sent cable after cable urging him to come to her and begging her American friends not to judge hastily or condemn before all the facts are known. Then she believes it will be found that Ismay is to be praised instead of being held forth as a subject of international condemnation. She believes in him implicitly and trusts to his ability to clear himself, and meanwhile she is torn by anxiety and humiliation 3,000 miles from the husband upon whose honor she stakes her own pride and love. Before her marriage, Mrs. Ismay was the courted and captivating Miss Schieffelin, daughter of Mrs. George R. Schieffelin of New York, and the niece of Gustav Amsink. One of her sisters is Mrs. C. Bauer Ismay. Another is Mrs. Henry G. Lefevre, and her brother George R. D. Schieffelin married Miss Louise Scribner. And then this one is about Mrs. Astor. Mrs. Astor has a serious relapse. Her condition causes alarm, but there is hope she will rally. New York, April 23rd. Mrs. Madeline Force Astor relapsed today into the state of nervous weakness that caused so much alarm to her family the day after her return upon the Carpathia. She rallied from it Sunday. And Monday was so much better that it was believed she was in no further danger as a direct result of her tragic experience aboard the Titanic. This afternoon, however, a reaction set in, and tonight she is under the constant care of her physician and nurses. Mrs. Astor's bearing aboard the Carpathia, and at the time of her arrival at the Fifth Avenue home Thursday evening, quite amazed her family. She kept herself wonderfully in hand, and even when 24 hours later she became very weak, the only surprise was that she did not sink to a lower ebb of vitality than she did. There is no reason to believe, however, that she will not rally from her present condition. Oh my goodness. And there's other things here. Let's see. So they're just talking about how the next boat, they're getting lots of lifeboats. And they were going, the crew of this next ship to sail were put through vigorous boat drill, and every member was found to lack experience in his specific duties. And let's see this one here. I'm sorry it didn't print out the newspaper that it came from. Titanic, the titan of the ocean finds watery grave on first trip. Over 1,400 people are drowned. White Star liner strikes an iceberg while going at full speed at 1:25 Monday morning and goes down in less than an hour. Women and children were saved. But many wealthy and prominent men are lost. Among them, Colonel John Jacob Astor. I guess that's the husband of the woman that we just read about. Major Archibald Butt, Isidore Strauss, George D. Widener, J. Bruce Ismay, Benjamin Guggenheim, Colonel Washington Roebling, J. B. Thayer, the artist Millet, and many others. Millet or Millet, I don't know. And there is Major Archibald Butt. I hope that's how you say his name. Let's see, New York, New York. The White Star Liner Titanic, the world's greatest steamship, has gone down some 500 miles off Cape Race with 620 of her 1,300 passengers and her full crew of 860 men on board. That the greatest catastrophe in marine history has occurred to a vessel of their line is admitted by the officials of the White Star Steamship Company in New York. The liner Carpathia, the first vessel to come within sight of the Titanic, rescued all the Titanic's lifeboats, in which were 670 persons, I think that says. When the Carpathia reached the ill-fated vessel, no sign of life was to be seen anywhere. The mountainous ocean swells giving much evidence to the stupendous disaster. Early reports stated that all the passengers and the crew of the Titanic had been taken off by the Allen liners Virginian and the Parisian and the Carpathia, but the wireless message received here discredits these reports in every detail. Only by a miracle, it is pointed out, could any person who stood by the ship escape the great vessel's powerful suction as she sank to the bottom. The Titanic carried the most notable list of passengers ever borne across the Atlantic by one vessel. Homecoming American tourists postponed their sailing weeks ago so as to ride the new wonder of the season on her maiden voyage. The collision of the Titanic with an iceberg is now known to have been a heated crash that occurred while the liner was proceeding little less than her best speed. She was a day ahead of her schedule, and it is considered probable that an attempt to make a record-breaking voyage was the hope of her crew when she entered the ice field. Her forward plates were completely wrecked. A gaping wound opened below her waterline and letting the water into her forward compartments. In the meantime, the lifeboats were manned, and into them were placed as many of the women and children as they could hold. The boats were put off while there was yet some hope of saving the Titanic afloat until wireless could summon help. Later and more conservative estimates tell of great bravery on the part of the men passengers. There was a minimum of disorder. John Jacob Astor, who, with his bride, was returning from their long honeymoon abroad, saw his bride placed in a lifeboat safely away. Colonel Astor was drowned. The work of getting the lifeboats away, the work of allaying the fears of the great crowd of passengers as much as possible. The work of keeping the pumps in operation and the engines throbbing, these tasks and countless others were directed by Captain Smith, the venerable commander of the Titanic, and before her advent the commander of the Olympic, who displayed almost superhuman power of mind and body at the world's most horrible sea disaster, crowned his long and honorable service on the high seas. A wireless message from the Virginia states that the occupants of the small boats which she picked up have been transferred to the Carpathia, which is proceeding to New York. The Titanic struck the iceberg at 1:25 Sunday night and floundered at 2:20 Monday morning. At daybreak, the Carpathia arrived on the scene, and her passengers and crew brought the small boats with their precious human cargo into New York. The boats which rushed to the Titanic's aid found only the scattered lifeboats and a dismal scene of wreckage. Sinking by the head, and women are being rushed into the lifeboats, were the last words that sputtered into the wireless room of the Virginian from the Titanic. All through the night and until her wireless station was silenced over hundreds of miles of seas from the antenna of the giant liner, flashed the mystic and magic SOS. The worldwide cry of distress on the ocean. Every wireless operator within range of the doomed vessel dropped other messages to locate, and many relayed the fatal message to the world. The collision occurred in latitude 4146 north and longitude 5014 west, 1,150 miles east of New York and 450 miles south of Cape Race, the most westerly point of Newfoundland. Contrary to earlier dispatches, there was no storm when the vessel struck. The weather was clear and calm. And so there's the rest of the story, but I won't read the whole thing. And this is a picture of Mrs. John Jacob Astor. I think it's better with the light off. And this here is a picture, drawing of John Jacob Astor. So I did take a look and try to write down where these articles came from. This is from the, I don't know if that's Weibo or Weibo, Pioneer, April 19th, 1912, Montana publication. So now here, this is from something separate. I just printed this out for this little part right here. It says Kipling gave poetic warning against spot where Titanic sank. It says the spot where the Titanic sank has long been notorious among navigators and ocean travelers as one of the most dangerous in the Atlantic. So well known is this that Rudyard Kipling a few years ago memorialized it in a poem called 40 North and 50 West. And I'll read the poem here. When the cabin portholes are dark and green because of the seas outside, When the ship goes wop with a wiggle between, and the trunks begin to slide. When Nursey lies on the floor in a heap, and Mommy says to let her sleep, and you aren't waked or washed or dressed, why then you may know, if you haven't guessed, that you're 40 north and 50 west. Oh, then you may know, if you haven't guessed, that you're 40 north and 50 west. The exact spot where the Titanic went down was 4146 north and 5014 west. Strange. And here, I thought this was interesting. The last dinner that was served on the Titanic, April 14th, 1912. Hors d'oeuvre, berries, oysters, consommé Olga, cream of barley, salmon, mousseline sauce, and forgive me if I mispronounce these things, cucumbers, filet mignon, lily, sauté of chicken, lyonnaise, vegetable marrow, is that farci, lamb, mint sauce, roast duckling, applesauce, sirloin of beef, chateau potatoes, green peas, creamed carrots, boiled rice. I don't know what that is. Parmentier, and boiled new potatoes, punch romaine, roast squab and cress, cold asparagus, vinaigrette pâté de foie gras, celery, Waldorf pudding, peaches in chartreuse jelly, chocolate and vanilla eclair, and French ice cream. And this is from, again, the Day Book, April 19th, 1912, publication from Chicago, Illinois. And let's see, this was the part about the band playing. So I'm just reading this little section right here. It says, the ship's band played as the boats were being lowered. These musicians were the real heroes. They played selections from operas and latest popular melodies of Europe and America. Only before the final plunge did they change the character of the program. Then they drifted into Nearer, My God, to Thee. And we remember that from the movies. So I thought this story was sort of funny to read. So there's this story here about these two little children that were on the ship. And at the top says, French woman may claim Titanic orphans. Girl who would adopt them weeps. It's kind of funny to the way they wrote it, but let's see, it says, Nice, France, April 23rd. And this is from the Day Book again. April 23rd, from Chicago, Illinois. The mystery of the orphans of the Titanic perhaps is cleared up. The orphans of the Titanic are two chubby-faced, curly-haired, laughing French babies who from the high decks of the sinking Titanic were tossed into the lap of Miss Margaret Hayes of New York as she sat on the last of the lifeboats. The children are boys, one 4 years old and the other 2. They talk French. The older answers to the name of Louis, but has not been able to give his last name. They were just 2 nameless but highly lovable little orphans who came to Miss Hayes as from heaven itself. Madame, MME, Madame Jean Navratil, wife of a tailor living here, says they probably are her children. Louis, 4 years old, and Lola, 2. 2 months ago, Madame Navratil quarreled with her husband over what Madame Navratil chose to regard as excessive attention that gentleman paid to another woman. Navratil did not stay to see the quarrel out. He left his wife and shortly afterwards contrived to kidnap the children. Madame Navratil had no money wherewith to trace her husband or children, inasmuch as her late helpmeet had taken the precaution of taking all their money and her jewels before his departure. Madame Navratil heard a rumor that her husband was going to America and that he intended taking the children with him. She also heard he had forbidden the children ever to mention the name of their mother, and a vague rumor as to the position the other woman now occupied in the household of Père Navratil. But she had no money, and what can a woman do without money? In the second cabin of the Titanic, there was a passenger who went by the name of Hoffman. He had 2 little children with him. He told other passengers he was a widower. And the long arm of coincidence again works here. The name of Navratil's closest friend is Hoffman. Madame Navratil is going to find out if the Titanic orphans are her children, and if they are, claim them. So now we go to New York, April 23rd. This part is what kind of made me laugh. When a reporter told pretty 19-year-old Margaret Hayes, who is the woman that sort of rescued the children, or that they landed in her lap on the lifeboat, that perhaps she was going to lose her orphans, she wept. The reporter read her the cablegram from Nice in regard to Madame Navratil. And this is what she says. "I suppose they are her children," said Miss Hayes, "and I suppose I shall have to give them up. Just when I had come to love them too, and had made up my mind to adopt them. It isn't fair. But this woman is their mother, but I had just fallen in love with the idea of adopting the 2 babies that came to me as from heaven. Yet," and a smile broke through Miss Hayes's tears, "it would be ridiculous for a girl of my age to adopt 2 children that way, wouldn't it?" The reporter, who was quite human and therefore was gazing into Mrs. Hayes's eyes, agreed that it would be utterly, utterly ridiculous. Whereupon Miss Hayes flared up most royally. "I don't care," she said. "I love them, and even if I'm quite young, I know I should have made a good mother for them, and that French woman will have to prove she's their mother." Let's see. "Before she gets them too, so there." Just then there came a squawking cry of protest from somewhere upstairs. "That's the lump," said Miss Hayes. the lump being the name Miss Hayes has wished upon the younger of the orphans of the Titanic, without misrepresentation at all. With that she gathered upon her skirts and fled up the stairs, 2 at a time, to find out and remove the cause of that wail of protest. So that was the end of the article in this paper. But I had to look around because I wanted to see what happened. So I found this one from the daybook from about a month later, May 20th, 1912. Mother clasps Titanic waifs. And here is the French woman, the mother of the 2 babies, Madame Navratil, and her 2 little boys rescued from the Titanic. So here it says, dressed in deep mourning, Mrs. Michael Navratil, Michelle Navratil, mother of the 2 Titanic waifs, who were thrown into the arms of Miss Margaret Hayes by their father as the last lifeboat left the ship, arrived in New York and hurried to her babies. The meeting between the mother and her boys was a succession of tears and joyful embraces. The 2 children, affectionately named by Miss Hayes Lolo and Lump, are really Michelle, age 4, and Edmund, age 2. Lump's French nickname is Maman, if I'm saying that right. So, that was interesting. I'm glad I could find the outcome of the situation. And that's it. I think that I read all of the papers that I printed out. There was so many to choose from, and I didn't want it to be too long, but so that's it. I hope that you enjoyed that. That was sort of a little bit different than what I was expecting to do about the Titanic, but I thought it was interesting. So thank you for watching.